Hello friends and welcome to my channel. Today's cards feature Altenew's new stencil art for the month, Painted Geraniums. This 6-piece stencil set produces a large and gorgeous image. I've trimmed them down to fit an A2 size card, but honestly they would be gorgeous framed. I'll be stenciling on white cardstock. I've simply taken an 8.5 by 11 sheet of cardstock and divided it vertically in half. To apply the fresh dye inks, I'll be using a combination of both the mini and micro blending brushes. For my first image, I'm using the pretty pink tones from Blush Berry Bliss. Altenew's fresh dye inks are made up of 4 different colors that are related and in a gradient. I'll be applying the inks lightest to darkest, and stencil 1 was done with strawberry. The second stencil is lined up, and these are very easy to align. And this time I'll be applying the next ink in this gradient called Dusty Pink. The stenciling goes very quickly. Moving on to stencil 3, there are 2 different sections that have been divided with an etched line. I'll be applying Blush Rose, and this is the start of adding some of those pretty details in the center of the flowers that will give it so much depth. This stencil will be repositioned by turning it around. This section is going to complete the flowers. I'll be adding my darkest color, Raspberry Sorbet. And once you see this, when the stencil comes off, you'll be blown away. Well, I think it is absolutely gorgeous. Stencil 4 will lay the base for the stems and leaves and also add in another small dark detail to the center of the flowers. Really wanted the flowers to be the star of the show, so I chose something neutral for the foliage. I'll be working with warm grays, and for stencil 4 I'm applying evening gray. For all of the stenciling, I would say that I'm applying medium pressure. I don't want it to be so completely opaque as the ink goes on. I want there to be some variation to give it a more natural look. So as I apply the ink, I will lighten it up, particularly as I move to the outside edges of leaves and petals. This stencil has one little stem that needs to be repositioned, and so I'll add that in, and then we're finished with stencil 4. And on to stencil 5, and this time I'm going to be applying Moon Rock. Just like the pink tones, I'm working from lightest to darkest. I love it when you start adding the dark tones to the image. This is when you can really start seeing the depth. It has so much dimension. And this geranium is finished up with stencil 6, and I'll be applying the darkest of my grays, Lava Rock. Just look at this. I think it would be gorgeous framed. I'll be using Golden Sunset fresh dye inks for the second geranium. Be continuing with the warm gray inks for the foliage. Of course, this will be very repetitive, so I'm just going to touch on the colors that I've used for the flowers. As you can see, I have my inks lined up above my panel from lightest to darkest. And for stencil 1, I'm applying Sunray. Chamomile, my next darkest ink, will be applied for stencil 2. Stencil 3 is when you can really start to see those flowers come to life. For this one, I'll be applying a beautiful orange yellow called Snapdragon. Stencil 3 has the additional sections, so I turn my stencil around and realign it. And this time I'm going to be adding in my darkest tone, which is called Terracotta. I just love this stage in the stenciling, and just like the previous geranium, the details of the center of the flowers, the leaves and stems will be completed with the warm grays. And fast forward, here it is completed. And really, I say fast forward, but it just does not take very long to stencil this gorgeous flower. I'll be using the add-on die to cut the blooms out. I'm a big fan of dimensions, so I've also used the die to cut white sheet foam. I have not popped the foam die cut out. I've just removed some of those little center pieces. This will make it very easy to align this big die cut to the foam one. The foam die cut will be slightly recessed as compared to the surrounding foam, and so the cardstock one will just slip into position. The little bits of foam that were popped out of the center help with any final alignment, and this is set aside to dry completely before the excess is removed. For the background, dark gray cardstock has been embossed using the Raised Sentiments 3D embossing folder. This is an amazing folder. There's so much dimension that the text is super easy to read. I've popped it onto an A2 size black card base, and I see a little bit of black peeking out, so I'm just going to trim that off. The foam back geraniums were left to dry for roughly 10 or 15 minutes before the excess foam was removed. And then they're adhered to the card bases. And one of the geraniums I left full size to trim down later, and the other one I trimmed down ahead of time. So it doesn't really matter how you do it. And I'm just going to pop one of my acrylic plates on top. I want there to be good contact between all of the different areas of the geranium and that raised background. I'll be using pocket sentiments for this card. This is a sweet set with smaller size sentiments, which I thought were perfect for these cards because I didn't want to detract from that beautiful geranium. They'll be stamped on the same gray cardstock that was used for the background using Versamark ink. The font on these sentiments is a little bit thicker, so I'm using a pressure tool so that I get a consistent impression. And I can see the stamping on that gray cardstock, and it's not perfect, so I'm going to ink it up a second time. And so there are a couple of things at play here that make that possible. Firstly, using the stamp wheel will ensure that it will line up perfectly. And secondly, the Versamark ink is slow drying. So even if my second impression isn't perfect, between the two, they will be. And while I was doing this, I had my heat tool coming to full temperature. This will help to reduce the amount of time that it takes to melt that embossing powder. So between doing that and also applying the heat to the front and the back of the panel, this will help to minimize warping. I'll be using the coordinating dies to cut my sentiments, and I will also be using them to cut black sheet foam. Foam die cuts have not been popped out, and I can easily align the cardstock ones to them. Before I remove the excess foam, I'll let them dry with a little bit of weight on top. And in the meantime, I'll add some embellishments. For the yellow-orange geranium, I'm going to be adding in Nature's Wonders enamel dots. And for the geranium in the pink tones, I'll be using Sugar Plum's enamel dots. These embellishments are adhesive backed. I find it easiest to position them onto the panel using my craft pick. The pick is placed at the base of each enamel dot, and then I push it a little bit until it catches the adhesive. Then I can easily lift it over to the panel and pop it in place. And my sentiments are dry. I've popped them out of the excess foam, and they'll be adhered to the base of each of the geraniums. And that wraps up this pair of cards featuring Altenew's 6-piece stencil set, Painted Geraniums. These are absolutely spectacular flowers. On a card or framed, they definitely make a statement. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and as always, I appreciate your visit.